The witness file was not just a collection of local tragedies, it was the documented statistical proof of a nation's failing. The official silence of the Nigerian government, which sought to label the crisis as mere farmer-herder clashes, stood in stark contradiction to the verifiable human cost. A recent report by the International Society for Civil Liberties and Rule of Law, Intersociety, estimated that in the first 220 days of 2025 alone, from January 1 to August 10, a minimum of 7,087 Christians were massacred across Nigeria, with no fewer than 7,800 others violently seized and abducted. This staggering toll, which translated to a median of 30 Christian deaths and 35 abductions every single day, provided the relentless, numerical drive behind Ilyas Gang's mission. His personal grief, beginning in the hills of Mangu, was the sharp, specific detail of a genocide that was rapidly becoming a national stain. Ilyas Gang's life was dictated by the gentle slope of the Mangu Hills and the stubborn resilience of the guinea corn he planted. He was a man defined by routine, the morning prayers, the calloused grip of the hoe, and the evening stories told by the glow of a kerosene lamp. His world, predominantly Christian and agrarian, felt anchored, unchanging. That anchor snapped in the hours between Saturday and Sunday. The sounds did not start with shouting, but with a distinct mechanical stutter of automatic gunfire echoing off the nearby rock formations, a sound no farmer should ever know. Ilyas dragging his 12-year-old son, Luca, into the shallow drainage trench behind their compound could taste the metallic tang of fear and the acrid smoke of burning thatch. He saw the figures moving with chilling purpose, not like bandits, but like soldiers executing an order. They called out specific names and targeted the church building first, their voices amplified by an ideological fervor that eclipsed the mere criminality. He never saw his wife, Naomi, or his 2 daughters after they fled toward the back shed. When the sun finally rose, casting long crimson shadows that seemed to mock the violence, Ilyas climbed out of the earth. Mangu was silent. The silence was the most terrifying thing. The absence of life, the quiet, chilling proof of completed work. He walked through the scorched paths, the smell of destruction clinging to his clothes, his heart a hollow drum. The local authorities categorized it as a clash over grazing rights. But Ilyas knew the truth. Nothing of his was grazed, only his family taken, leaving behind a silence that was rapidly turning into an unheeded cry for justice. He vowed, then and there, that this silence would not prevail. The trek from Mangu to Riom was a silent funeral march, a procession of the dispossessed moving deeper into the already crowded relief centers. Ilyas and Luca joined thousands huddled under tattered tarpaulins, their faces etched with the same blend of exhaustion and disbelief. Luca, especially, bore the weight of trauma. He rarely spoke, his gaze fixed on some far invisible point, the 1,000-yard stare of a child who had seen too much. In Riom, the systematic nature of the displacement became clearer. Ilyas spoke to Pastor Zaka, whose church had been a perennial target. 6 times we rebuilt, Zaka sighed, gesturing to the patched-up structure. They burn the sanctuary, they kill the harvest, and then they settle. It is not grazing, it is occupation. This realization that the violence served a dual purpose of religious cleansing and territorial acquisition galvanized Ilyas. He knew vague appeals for help would fail. He needed proof of motive. With Pastor Zaka's help, Ilyas used his old, fragile mobile phone, its screen crisscrossed with cracks, to document the evidence. He photographed the mass graves hastily dug into the clay, the consistent trajectory of bullet holes in the church walls, and the specific graffiti left by the attackers on surviving structures. messages that explicitly invoked religious supremacy. This collection of raw, verifiable data, gathered from Riom and the surrounding hamlets, was the foundation of what Elias would come to call the witness file. He was gathering the fragments of truth the world was ignoring, turning blood and ash into undeniable facts. Bocas was a county forever etched in the collective memory of Plateau Christians as the site of one of the most brutal coordinated attacks, particularly during the solemnity of the Christmas season. The ITP camp here was massive, sprawling, and overflowing with people who carried the specific chilling burden of having survived an assault on a holy night. It was here that Elias met Sarah Chen, a field operative for a small but tenacious international nonprofit focused on religious freedom. Sarah was unlike the uniformed aid workers. She was quiet, meticulous, and focused only on documentation for external legal bodies. Elias watched her work, her camera recording not just faces, but the specific, detailed accounts of the survivors. Sarah explained to Elias the political framework that minimized their suffering. In Washington and Geneva, the violence is easily dismissed as intercommunal conflict or climate-induced farmer-herder clashes. It's a convenient label that absolves the world of intervention. She saw in Elias an uncorrupted witness, a man who had no political agenda, only grief. She proposed a collaboration. Elias would provide the irrefutable local grounding of the witness file, and she would provide the pipeline to the U.S. Congress and relevant international bodies. Your story, Elias, she told him, her eyes earnest, is the only thing powerful enough to make the distinction, to say this is not chaos, this is a calculated atrocity. This meeting in Bocas transformed Elias from a grieving victim into a determined agent of change, ready to confront the world with his painful truth. Barkin Ladi had long been the epicenter of the Middle Belt conflict, a zone so volatile that the pervasive sites of military patrols offered no real security. Elias and Sarah spent grueling weeks here, transforming the raw photos and frantic scribbles into the cohesive witness file. They sought out the medical staff who had treated the victims from places like Raruru and Tatu, meticulously cataloging the nature of the injuries. Head trauma, deep, methodical machete wounds, and execution-style bullet placement, reported one weary clinic nurse. They are wounds of calculated extermination, not of struggle. They are intended to terrorize survivors and eliminate any chance of return. Elias began interviewing community leaders, cross-referencing death tolls and displacement figures with local church records, which proved far more accurate than government estimates. He calculated the local toll, a microcosm of the national crisis which had already claimed 7,087 Christian lives and seen 7,800 Christians abducted in 2025 alone, proving the local devastation mirrored the national atrocity. The consistency was terrifying. Attacks occurred overwhelmingly on days of Christian significance, Sundays, Christmas, Easter, and the assailants consistently prioritized the destruction of churches, Bibles, and farmlands belonging to Christian residents. This data allowed them to build a powerful case that negated the grazing rights excuse. The witness file grew into a professionally prepared document detailing timelines, modus operandi, and the religious rhetoric accompanying the attacks. Elias learned to manage his own trauma, compartmentalizing his grief to focus solely on the facts. He felt his family's presence not as a distraction, but as the relentless drive behind every name added, every date verified, and every tragic detail secured for posterity. Bassa County was a region characterized by a relentless war of attrition against the Irigui people, where villages were attacked not in grand single massacres, but in continuous, demoralizing raids designed to bleed the community dry over years. It was here that Elias met Ishaya, a young man of 20 who was now the sole provider for 5 younger siblings after losing his parents and uncles in various ambushes. Ishaya embodied the younger generation's despair and defiance. "We are tired of burying the dead," Ishaya told Elias, his eyes burning with an exhausted anger. "If the government won't protect us, who will hear the blood crying from the ground?" Elias, seeing his own son, Luca, reflected in Ishaya's grief, felt his resolve solidify. He made a solemn vow, echoing the ancient covenant of his faith, but directed toward the political structures of the present world. The blood spilled on the plateau would not simply soak into the red earth. It would become a torrent that washed into the international consciousness. Sarah confirmed their next steps. They had secured preliminary contacts in Benue State, and, critically, they had a dangerous, high-risk plan to travel to Borno to secure a witness from the Northeast. This trip was essential, as it would link the violence of the Middle Belt, attributed primarily to Fulani militias, with the undeniable religious extremism of the Northeast, Boko Haram/ISWAP, proving a nationwide campaign rooted in ideological hate, not just local politics. The witness file was complete for Plateau, but the story was only halfway told. The journey south from Plateau's arid hills led Elias and Sarah to Otukbo, deep in Benue State, the ancestral home of the Idoma people and a region reeling from similar patterns of violence. Here, they met Barrister Turner, a human rights lawyer whose reputation was built on courage and tireless documentation of atrocities. Turner's office, in contrast to the dusty fields, was packed with legal texts and case files, each one a testament to unheeded suffering. He immediately grasped the strategic value of the witness file, but focused on the legal framework. The key to international action is proving dolus specialis, the specific intent for genocide, Turner explained, leaning over a map marked with red circles of devastation. The world accepts clashes because it suggests mutual lack of intent. Our evidence must move beyond systemic attack to prove the intent to destroy the Christian religious group, in whole or in part. Turner agreed to lend his legal expertise, formalizing the testimonies under Nigerian law and translating the raw evidence into the precise language required by international bodies. He meticulously demonstrated how the repeated and synchronized nature of the raids, the specific targeting of Christian leadership, and the burning of churches on holy days negated any claim of random conflict. This was not chaos. This was an operation targeting the very existence of a protected group. Elias watched the advocate, realizing that Turner was taking on a battle not with a machete or a gun, but with the cold, powerful weapons of jurisprudence and verifiable truth. The integration of Plateau's and Benue's evidence, framed by Turner's legal mind, would make the case irrefutable. This was not a local skirmish, but a systematic cross-regional campaign of atrocity with genocidal intent. Guma County, particularly the area around Makurdi, offered a chilling continuation of the Plateau narrative, but with even greater intensity regarding displacement. Elias and Turner visited sites like Yellow-Wata, where not less than 200 people were massacred recently. People were burned alive inside their houses, and many others were shot dead when suspected herdsmen launched a late-night attack. The attack, which occurred between Friday night and the early hours of Saturday, saw the assailants split into two groups. One stormed the nearby police station, while the other moved house to house, killing residents, mostly women and children, and setting buildings ablaze, one of the survivors narrated. Turner focused Elias on the concept of mapping not just loss of life, but loss of infrastructure, the societal pillars of the Christian communities. They methodically cataloged the sheer number of churches reduced to rubble, primary schools intentionally burned to prevent education, and the widespread destruction of silos and stored crops. The systematic destruction of the means of survival, churches, schools, silos, is proof of genocidal intent, Elias, Turner specified. It is not enough to kill. They are creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction, eliminating the ability to rebuild the social and spiritual fabric. Elias felt the heavy spiritual weight of the ground, realizing that the earth here was not just fertile for farming, but saturated with unacknowledged grief. Luca, who had been quiet throughout the journey, finally spoke a single sentence while staring at a burned cross. They couldn't burn the faith, Papa. It was a small, profound moment that reaffirmed Elias's purpose. He was fighting for the right to rebuild, the right to exist, and the right for that small spark of faith to continue burning, a resilience he saw budding in his traumatized son. Agatu County represented the most brutal intersection of land and faith. Lying along the Benue River, the land was prized for its rich annual yields of rice and yams, making it a constant magnet for conflict. Elias listened horrified as elders described the tactical brutality. Attackers often showed no mercy to women and children, committing acts of grotesque violence to ensure not just death, but complete psychological terror on any potential returnees. One elder spoke of babies being snatched from their mothers' backs. The sheer savagery convinced Elias that this was beyond simple revenge or grazing disputes. Turner pointed out that the economic motive, seizing the fertile riverine land, and the ideological motive, cleansing the area of Christian farmers, were two sides of the same coin. The land they want is farmed by Christians, Turner stated. To take the land, they must eradicate the identity tied to it. The violence is the tool of the takeover, and the religious identity of the victims is the selection criteria. The documentation here focused on proving the victims were settled, agrarian, and Christian, while the attackers were transient, armed, and motivated by an extremist zeal. The scale of the displacement in Agatu, with entire communities pushed into neighboring states, solidified the term genocide in Elias's mind. It was a coordinated strategy to empty and occupy a specific demographic territory through acts calculated to bring about its physical destruction, specifically aimed at eliminating the genetic and cultural carriers of the future community. The critical work in Guer West, particularly in the satellite settlements around Naka, shifted from gathering physical evidence to securing legally sound human testimony. Elias and Turner required formal, notarized affidavits from survivors of massacres in places like Tse and Swam. This was the most psychologically taxing phase. The affidavits were not simple statements. Turner ensured they followed strict legal formats, requiring survivors to detail the command structure they observed, the specific religious slurs used, and any evidence of coordinated logistics like radio communications or advanced weaponry. Turner meticulously extracted accounts proving that the primary purpose was not to loot, but to kill or forcibly displace the Christian population. This step was fraught with risk, as signing a legal document that implicated specific groups and acknowledged a religious motive made the survivor an undeniable target. Turner had to work painstakingly, reassuring the displaced that this act of courage was their only route to accountability. Elias, sharing his own story of Mungu before each interview, created a bridge of trust. He realized the true power of their witness file was not in the sheer number of dead, but in the chain of living names, real people who had survived and were willing to stand up, their identities affixed to the truth. Every signature was an act of profound faith, a belief that their words could transcend the pervasive political denial. This collection of affidavits transformed the narrative from reports into legal depositions, giving the witness file the necessary weight to be taken seriously in a U.S. courtroom or congressional hearing as evidence of genocidal acts. In Apa County, the legal and humanitarian package for the Middle Belt was finalized. Working long hours in a small, secure room, Barrister Turner structured the document with cold legal precision. He organized the witness file into two essential legal pillars, centered squarely on genocide. Pillar 1, Acts of Physical Destruction. This section used the Plateau and Benua data, mass killings, forcible transfer, systematic destruction of food sources, and targeting of vulnerable populations to prove that the violence constituted acts calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the Christian religious group. Pillar 2, Proof of Intent, Dolus Specialis. Turner argued that the perpetrator's actions, destroying religious symbols, using extremist rhetoric, and prioritizing permanent displacement, went beyond typical conflict and conclusively demonstrated the specific intent required by the Genocide Convention. Elias confirmed his agreement with the high-risk trip to Borno. Turner insisted they needed a witness from the Northeast to complete the argument, to show that whether the perpetrator was a Fulani militia or Boko Haram, the underlying goal of eliminating Christian presence was the same. Elias, despite the danger, agreed. He knew that for his family's blood to truly speak, it had to connect the entire nation's tapestry of suffering. The journey to Borno was a terrifying but necessary leap of faith, an acknowledgement that the full truth required staring into the eyes of the most overt form of extremism. The team's journey into southern Kaduna, a historical flashpoint of violence, immediately reinforced the Benue narrative, where the conflict was revealed to be a direct collision of land rights and religious identity. In Zangon-Kataf County, the evidence pointed to a calculated, repeated campaign to dismantle Christian farming communities. Elias documented the recent, coordinated attacks that claimed the lives of 27 Christians in the villages of Langson and Ungwan-Wakili. The attack on Langson, which commenced at 9 p.m. under the cover of darkness, was described by survivors not as a spontaneous clash, but as a deliberate military-style invasion. Survivors were adamant in their identification of the assailants as Muslim Fulani herdsmen who came along with terrorists, revealing the disturbing fusion of traditional militia and extremist elements. Crucially, the evidence detailed a documented history of the perpetrators having deliberately destroyed our farms and crops prior to the mass killings. This was the irrefutable link. Violence served as the final enforcement mechanism for an engineered territorial takeover. Barrister Turner categorized this as a critical dimension of the genocide case, the systematic eradication of the Christian group's entire economic base and ancestral claim to the highly fertile lands, a move calculated to ensure they could never return and rebuild their lives. Elias felt the echoes of Mungui, recognizing the same pattern: kill the people to seize the land, then destroy the means of survival to cement the displacement. The sheer scale and targeting of these attacks transformed simple crime into a strategic act of genocidal intent, aimed at dismantling the Christian farming community in its entirety. In Kachia County, The nature of the violence escalated to coordinated militarized ambushes, demonstrating the chilling preparation and logistical support behind the attacks. The farming community of Waki was hit in a terrifying dawn raid on September 7, 2025, which claims 9 lives and wounded 8 others. Elias collected the testimony of Douglas Fogo, a survivor who spoke of the horror of watching his community consumed by fire and violence. Fogo described the chilling scene. Assailants, identified by their ethnicity and extremist ideology, arrived heavily armed, some on motorbikes, others on foot, converging from different directions from the forest near Danin Maro, a notorious hub for Fulani ethnic militia. The attackers did not attempt to hide their motive. They made their ideological intent explicit, shouting Allahu Akbar, a religious war cry, as they fired indiscriminately and torched homes. This use of extremist rhetoric, coupled with the clear paramilitary coordination of the assault, was a crucial piece of evidence for the witness file, moving the case beyond any political denial of mere banditry or resource conflict. The raid lasted for more than 2 agonizing hours, with victims trapped and overwhelmed by the militants' firepower. Turna argued that this coordinated drone attack, complete with an ideological battle cry, provided conclusive legal evidence of dolus specialis, the specific intent required to prove genocide, as the sole purpose was to inflict maximum terror and destroy the civilian, predominantly Christian population of the village. The trauma in Fogo's voice, recounted in the affidavits, provided the necessary human face to the legal argument. Kajuru County tragically embodied the multifaceted assault designed to dismantle the Christian community's present and future. Elias documented an immediate and visceral attack, the brutal Friday assault on an evangelical church winning all Bible study and prayer service in Kampani village, where 5 Christians, Victor Haruna, Dogara Jatau, Luka Yari, Jesse Dalami, and Bau John were murdered. This act was a deliberate, violent assault on the community's spiritual center and practice. In addition to the killings, residents reported the staggering figure of at least 110 kidnappings in the first 6 months of the year, with victims consistently drawn from predominantly Christian villages such as Baura, Unguwan Yashi, and Unguwan Mulki. This pervasive threat of abduction was not just criminal. Turna argued that mass kidnapping, particularly targeting the youth and community leaders like Obadiah Digura, constituted a profound form of genocide by disruption of future life. By rendering communities perpetually vulnerable and forcing them to expend their meager resources on ransoms, the perpetrators were systematically creating conditions calculated to bring about the group's economic and physical destruction. Happiness Daniel, a resident, captured the paralyzing reality of life under this constant siege. We constantly live in fear every day. We can't sleep in our homes and we can't go to farms. This chronic paralyzing fear, this manufactured inability to perform the most basic acts of survival, was documented as definitive evidence that the perpetrators were intentionally making Christian existence in these counties economically and psychologically impossible. The climax of terror in southern Kaduna centered on the calculated assassination of Christian clergy, a strategy designed to decapitate the community's moral and spiritual center. In Koru County, the abduction and subsequent killing of the Reverend Sylvester Okechukwu, priest of St. Mary Catholic Church in Takira, was an act of profound ideological terror. The Reverend Okechukwu was seized from his rectory shortly after 9 p.m. on March 4th, only for his lifeless body to be discovered the next morning, Ash Wednesday. The sheer symbolism of the timing, a priest murdered on one of the holiest days of the Christian calendar, was intentional, aimed at maximizing the despair and spiritual demoralization of the entire Kafanchan diocese. Area priest Williams Ava articulated the heartbreak and outrage. What a day and manner to die. He had his ashes ready and was going to mark the foreheads of parishioners. This morning his life was cut short and he has become dust before us. This targeted murder was not an isolated incident. It was coupled with a larger, coordinated assault that claimed 41 Christians in Kuru and Kajuru counties combined. The sheer scale and synchronization of these attacks, carried out by heavily armed terrorists, demonstrated a sophisticated level of planning aimed at maximizing casualties and dismantling the Christian communal structure by eliminating its spiritual leadership. The witness file presented this as direct evidence that the assailants understood the central, irreplaceable role of pastors and priests in fostering Christian resilience, and thus deliberately sought to eliminate them as a component of the genocidal campaign. Komaro County, particularly the small hamlet of Ongwan Rimi, provided the crucial final piece linking the violence of southern Kaduna directly back to the conflict's Plateau State epicenter. This community, composed of Irigwe families, maintained close and active ties to their kin in Basa County, Plateau State, underscoring the regional rather than localized nature of the violence. The most damning evidence collected in Komaro was a preemptive security alert passed from the Irigwe and Basa to their counterparts in Kauru. The Fulani are paired on motorbikes from Bahit, Zagum, and Binchi and gathering around a hill on the border with Kauru. This intelligence, detailing the movements of highly mobile, armed militants crossing state lines and gathering for coordinated strikes, was integrated into the witness file as irrefutable proof of a mobile, organized military campaign. The attacks were not random acts of criminality or localized disputes. They were movements of forces operating with logistical freedom and a singular, destructive goal. Turner stressed that this interstate communication and coordination proved the threat was not contained, but was a sprawling, regional network of militants. The evidence from southern Kaduna, particularly the use of explicit religious language in the attacks, the targeting of clergy, and the systematic destruction of farms, was conclusively integrated into the witness file, solidifying the overwhelming proof that the violence across the entire Middle Belt, from Plateau to Kaduna, was rooted in a singular, coordinated, genocidal intent. The Iron Rot South was simply the next stage of the same ideological fire. The shift in focus to Adamawa, the gateway to the turbulent Northeast, introduced a violence rooted primarily in explicit ideological warfare, though the outcomes mirrored the Middle Belt. Madagali County's experience with Boko Haram demonstrated persistent, deliberate targeting. The deadly night assault on Wagamamgoro on September 23 was a horror executed with cold efficiency, launched at 11:40 p.m. to maximize terror and minimize defense. The insurgents killed 4 Christians, including the father and son pair David and Daniel Mbicho, and injured many others, while systematically destroying homes, shops, and the local church building. The most critical evidence gathered by Elias came from survivors detailing the agonizing absence of official protection. Local vigilante groups were quickly overpowered by the militants' superior firepower, and official security forces did not arrive until the morning of September 24, hours after the attack had concluded. This government failure was not an anomaly. The village had been raided just 2 months prior, in July. Resident Cyrus Ezra, having tried to rebuild, resignedly confirmed that families were now permanently fleeing to the state capital, Yola. The inability or unwillingness of the state to protect smaller, predominantly Christian villages like Wagamangoro was documented by Turna as facilitation of the genocide by creating an environment of guaranteed impunity and forced displacement. Michika County provided the definitive, high-profile evidence of the Northeast's strategy to decapitate Christian resistance. The kidnapping and subsequent brutal beheading of the Reverend Lawan Ndimi, the state chairman of the Christian Association of Nigeria, CAN, by Boko Haram militants, became a flashpoint that shocked the nation and the world. The incident, occurring barely 2 weeks after President Buhari urged Nigerians to stop viewing acts of terror as a religious war, was a direct, violent contradiction of that official narrative. Reverend Andimi was not a random target.
He was the foremost Christian leader in the state, and his execution was meticulously planned to demoralize and destabilize the entire Christian community of Adamawa and beyond. Elias and Turner documented the vast resources and efforts the church expended in attempts to secure his release, highlighting the militants' uncompromising demand for ideological surrender. Turner argued that the murder of a high-ranking, visible religious leader like Reverend Andimi was not merely a crime, but a calculated and public act of terror against the leadership of a specific religious group, a clear and undeniable element of the crime of genocide by elimination of the group's essential moral and spiritual authority. The incident shattered any lingering national pretense that the crisis was anything other than a religiously motivated war against Nigeria's Christian populace.
Hong County provided a vital thematic link between the overt ideological warfare of the Northeast and the tactical terror seen in the Middle Belt, the deliberate targeting of Christian communities on their most sacred days. On Christmas Day, while residents were celebrating the birth of Christ, Boko Haram insurgents invaded the village. Resident Hosea Yakub's text message, "While Christians here in Kwapre were celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ, like other Christians across the world, Boko Haram invaded our community and killed 2 Christians," captured the cruel irony of the assault. The terrorists used deadly weapons like guns and machetes to maximize injury and destruction, looting shops and burning houses. The timing of this attack was absolutely critical for the witness file. Turner argued that attacking a community precisely on Christmas, mirroring the timing of massacres in Plateau State, was not coincidental. It was a calculated psychological operation designed to inflict maximum spiritual and emotional damage, turning a day of peace and worship into a day of blood and fear. This pattern established an ideological consistency across the entire span of the Nigerian conflict, proving that whether the perpetrator was a Fulani militia seizing land or Boko Haram asserting a caliphate, the underlying objective, to terrorize, displace, and eradicate the Christian presence, was unified and driven by a singular ideological genocidal intent. The investigation in Adamawa culminated in the chilling discovery of a governmental and judicial framework that actively suppressed Christian self-defense and invalidated the impunity of perpetrators. The murder of the clergyman, Reverend Dennis Bagauri, in Mayo Belwa was a tragedy of terrorism, but the case of Sunday Jackson was catastrophic for the cause of justice, exposing profound legal bias. Jackson, a Christian farmer, was arrested, charged, and found guilty of murder for defending himself against a Fulani terrorist he killed. Despite his insistence that he acted in self-defense, a court in Yola sentenced him to death by hanging. The fact that his appeals failed and the Supreme Court in March 2025 upheld the death sentence solidified his fate. This ruling, imposing the ultimate penalty on a Christian victim for self-preservation, stands in stark criminal contrast to the absolute impunity enjoyed by the Fulani militias responsible for thousands of unpunished deaths across the Middle Belt. Turner meticulously incorporated the Jackson case into the witness file as definitive legal evidence of judicial imbalance and government complicity. By actively validating the execution of a Christian who resisted attack, the Nigerian state's institutions were shown to be instruments that suppressed the right to life and self-defense for the victim group, thereby facilitating the continuation of the genocidal campaign through a terrifying legal double standard. The flight to the fringes of Borno was a descent into a different kind of war. Gwoza, once a vibrant community, was notorious for having been temporarily declared a caliphate by Boko Haram. The violence here was not masked by land disputes. It was explicit religious war. It was in a heavily secured safe house near a military barracks that Elias and Sarah met Aisha Alkali. Aisha was a former school teacher, a Christian woman who had endured years of forced captivity, escaping only through a harrowing trek across the mountains. Her testimony was terrifyingly specific. She described the systemic operations, the forced witnessing of public executions of those who refused to convert, the deliberate destruction of all Christian symbols, and the constant, chilling recitation of extremist doctrine. In Plateau, they burned their crops to take our land, Aisha said, her voice a low, steady tremor. Here, they burned our souls to take our faith. They told us they were cleansing the earth for God. Her words confirmed Turner's theory. The motive was unitary, spanning the Middle Belt and the Northeast. Elias felt a profound bond with Aisha. They were two sides of the same coin of suffering, one from a hidden massacre, the other from overt jihad. Her direct, unvarnished account of ideological intent was the missing piece that would shatter the international community's denial. In BU County, a region that had fiercely resisted the full-scale takeover by insurgents, Elias and Aisha visited a small, fortified structure, a church that was still active despite decades of proximity to terror. The pastor of the church spoke of the deep historical roots of Christianity in Borno, predating the current conflicts by generations. Aisha's story in this context became one of profound resilience. She recounted the constant psychological pressure during her captivity to renounce her faith, the daily threats, and the moments of silent prayer that kept her spirit alive. She explained that she chose to speak now because silence felt like a posthumous victory for her captors. They can take the body. They can burn the building, but they cannot take the Christ we hold inside, she declared to Elias. This powerful theme of unyielding faith, of resistance born from conviction, was integrated into the witness file. It transformed the narrative from one of mere martyrdom into a compelling story of perseverance, a crucial distinction for galvanizing Western support, which often preferred to fund and protect communities that showed the strength to fight for their survival, not just their faith. Bama was a visual testament to the sheer, monumental scale of the conflict in the Northeast. Once a bustling city, it was now a ghost town, its buildings reduced to hollowed-out concrete shells, a wasteland of strategic destruction. Walking through the rubble, Elias was overwhelmed. The destruction in Mangu and Riam had been localized, village by village. Bama was an industrial-scale catastrophe. Aisha pointed silently to the ruin of a marketplace where she had witnessed the execution of a relative who refused to denounce his faith. The sheer emptiness of Bama, coupled with the detailed testimonies of forced displacement and violence they collected from the few brave returnees, provided a chilling contrast to the land grab narrative of the Middle Belt. This chapter focused on the scale of the terrorist threat. By showing the two geographical areas, one facing encroachment and hidden genocide, the other facing overt city-level warfare, the witness file demonstrated that Christian communities were being targeted across a vast spectrum of violence, all aimed at the same goal: eradication or subjugation. The name Chibok carried a unique international resonance, synonymous with the horrific 2014 mass abduction of schoolgirls. Elias realized that the world had responded to the spectacle of the kidnapping, but had largely ignored the slow, grinding death toll in the surrounding villages. Aisha, who had connections to some of the families of the abducted girls, helped Elias draw a crucial link. The Chibok event and the Plateau massacres were branches of the same toxic tree. The kidnapping was an attack on the Christian community's future and identity, just as the village raids were attacks on its present. The witness file dedicated a section to arguing that the world's compassion for the Chibok girls was incomplete without recognizing the thousands of others killed by the same forces. Aisha included a statement linking her escape to the ongoing hope for the girl's release, thereby unifying the emotional pain of the Northeast with the physical loss of the Middle Belt. This strategic connection was designed to leverage existing global sympathy and redirect it toward a deeper, more systemic understanding of the religious persecution driving the conflict across Nigeria. Askira Uba served as the final perilous staging ground before the team's extraction. With Barrister Terna coordinating complex security and logistics, Elias, Aisha, and Sarah made their move. The tension was suffocating. They were carrying the truth that powerful actors, both within and outside Nigeria, did not want exposed. Weeks later, the dusty roads of Borno were a distant, surreal memory. Elias was sitting in a quiet, climate-controlled hearing room in Washington, D.C., the seat of global power. The trauma still resided in his chest, but it was countered now by a fierce, unyielding purpose. Luca, now safely residing with an aunt in a neighboring state, had written a simple letter. "Papa, tell them we are still here." This message was Elias's final script. Standing before a congressional committee, the silence of the room was different from the silence of Mongu. This was a silence of anticipation, a heavy vessel waiting to be filled. Elias didn't read from the witness file or follow Terna's carefully worded legal briefs. He spoke directly from his heart, about Naomi, about his little daughters, and about the site of his burning church. He spoke of Luca's unwavering gaze at the burned cross and the resilience that proved the perpetrators had failed to kill the faith. Aisha followed, her voice cutting through the political formality with the raw, devastating truth of ideological enslavement. Sarah Chen then laid out the witness file, Terna's legal framework connecting the Fulani militia's Dolus Specialis, genocidal intent, to the Islamist extremists' explicit goals. The impact was undeniable. The lawmakers listened not to a report, but to the living, breathing witnesses who had defied death to bring their truth across oceans. Within a few months, the U.S. Secretary of State announced a formal review of Nigeria's status, publicly acknowledging the need to investigate and prosecute the genocidal intent and systematic religious destruction based on the new, irrefutable evidence. The blood that cried from the ground in Nigeria had finally found its voice in the halls of global power. The policy review announcement was merely the first volley. The real work began in the weeks that followed. Barrister Terna, Sarah, and Elias, now working with an international coalition of advocates, consolidated their demands into the Blueprint of Justice, a detailed four-point plan submitted to the State Department and key congressional committees. Their goal was to translate the evidence of systematic religious cleansing into concrete, enforceable action that would end the impunity and government complicity they had so meticulously documented. Designation and sanctions for genocide, CPC status. This pillar directly addressed the staggering death toll, highlighting that the 7,087 Christians massacred and 7,800 abducted in the first 220 days of 2025 demonstrated a deliberate, massive campaign of violence. The plan demanded that the U.S. immediately designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern, CPC, for engaging in or tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. The designation would trigger mandatory sanctions against officials, including those identified as silencing witnesses and suppressing facts and those enabling judicial imbalance, as seen in the Sunday Jackson case, who were documented to have facilitated attacks, such as the military units that withdrew from their posts in villages like Nayarwa and allowed terrorists to enter. Protection, accountability, and end to impunity. The blueprint called for the establishment of an international monitoring task force with specific mandates to counter the deliberate targeting of the most vulnerable. This was a response to the devastating attacks on IDP settlements, like the attacks on resettled IDPs in Darul Jamal. It demanded judicial accountability for perpetrators, explicitly naming the two main vectors of violence, Boko Haram and ISWAP in the north, and Fulani militias in the Middle Belt, and insisted that the Nigerian government stop framing the violence as mere farmers-herders clashes. III. Territorial security and restoration of ancestral homes. Addressing the land grab motive, the occupation that Elias witnessed in Mangu and that cleared vast farmlands in Benu's Agatu and southern Kaduna. The plan demanded a clear international framework for securing the ancestral homes of displaced Christian communities. It mandated humanitarian aid specifically for the rebuilding of destroyed infrastructure, including the churches and schools burned in Mandaragiru, Kwaple, and Bama. The goal was not just survival, but the right to return and rebuild their societal fabric, ensuring the long-term physical existence of the group was not permanently dismantled. IV. Comprehensive trauma care and witness safety. The blueprint mandated a robust international program to provide long-term psychological care for the millions of internally displaced persons, IDPs, who carry the heavy burden of trauma and loss. It condemned the intentional neglect of the IDPs and the bulldozing of their makeshift camps described by advocates. Crucially, it demanded a secure witness protection program for courageous individuals like Elias and Daisha, whose lives were now forfeit for having revealed the truth. The blueprint was the final transformation of grief into governance, of blood into bureaucracy. It was a testament to the power of truth, proving that the silence of Mangu was finally drowned out by the global machinery of justice. Elias, seeing his family's story embedded in the language of international law, knew the battle for intervention had truly begun.